Welcome to Biceps and Banter with expert trainer Brandon Crow. Hold on to your dumbbells and get ready for this conversational style podcast focused on interesting, everyday drivel with tasty tidbits of health-related information sprinkled in. Enjoy.
Good to go whenever, man.
Cool. All right, awesome. So maybe let's just start. I'm sure a lot of your followers will know, but my followers may not. Tell me, who is Roland? How did you get started, and
who is
why?
Roland?
Yeah.
How did I get started?
Right.
Interesting question. So who am I? I would say that let's say as a professional. As a professional, I'm someone who absolutely loves the industry I'm in. So was always into sports. I was an athlete at a young age. And I was always trying to figure out, how do I get better performance? How do I get better recovery? So when I was studying exercise, I was also studying nutrition on the side for my own personal gain. And that led to me becoming decently knowledgeable, kind of like on the surface level of, you do this before a workout. These are some supplements you can take. This is what you eat to perform and all that. And I kind of, I indulged that interest longer and longer until I got to the point where I was forced to change careers. I was working in the city as a personal trainer, and there was an obstacle that was kind of in front of my path where I was not able to allow the next phase of my career to unfold. So it was basically like a guided, nope, this is as far as you go. And at the time, my girlfriend told me, he's like, why don't you become a nutritionist? Like, everyone asks you advice anyways. And I remember sitting in my kitchen with my phone to my ear saying, that's a great idea. I said, never crossed my mind. So I enrolled at a place called the Institute of Holistic Nutrition the next semester. And the rest has kind of been history. It's been something that I've been absolutely obsessed with, not on an unhealthy level, but something that was just totally engrossing to me. And I've thrown myself in the industry. Since then, I've become educated in functional medicine, which is a more oriented process of kind of looking at the synthesis of a disease. So from a functional level, quote unquote, the biochemistry behind what causes disease. And then I got connected with a world expert in anti-aging medicine who's become my mentor. We travel all around building out this framework called health optimization medicine, which is going to be the first practice focused on health management. So it's not to do with disease at all. If someone comes to me as a client with a disease, I can help you, but overall the goal is to improve the health and well-being of that individual as our definition of health relates to them from a starting point, if that makes sense.
Man, that's awesome, yeah.
It's cool, it's fun.
Jeez, how long have you been in your official functional medicine type role?
Probably about 2 years now. It's been kind of like throwing myself into it as I've learned and practiced on the practical side at the same time. And the health optimization stuff, which is now my focus, I don't do the functional medicine stuff at all anymore, has been really full force for about a year in April, so just over.
Okay, so what's the difference between health optimization and functional medicine then?
The difference is the focus of your practice intervention. So functional medicine is working off of a diagnosis and a treatment of disease. So Western medicine and all medicine or medical practices diagnose and treat disease. A doctor is allowed to diagnose, a nutritionist is not. However, a nutritionist can work off of a diagnosis that is existing. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to take someone who is sick and bring them back to a status of health. Health optimization medicine, all it does is it detects and corrects physiological imbalances, toxicities, deficiencies. So you're looking at what the body is missing and what is pushing the body out of balance to allow for the body to do what it innately knows to do in its infinite wisdom, which is to promote health and well-being, because cells don't know how to become sick. They just know to replicate, divide, and perform what they're meant to do. It's the imposition of what we do with our diet, our lifestyle, our emotions, the energies around us. That's what makes us sick. And it's kind of like a beautiful storm of all these variables as it relates to the individual. So if you have type 2 diabetes and another person has type 2 diabetes, those two people will not have the exact same reasons for why the disease development manifested, but the ultimate outcome is the same based upon you have this disease. So if someone is sick and they get better through health optimization, that's what I call a happy accident or a happy side effect.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Oh, that's awesome. So you're dealing more preventative, and you're dealing with people. So in an ideal scenario, people's nutrition is optimal, people sleep, stress, and all that thing. So
100%.
And then that leads to disease-free living?
Well, the goal is to basically say where someone is on the spectrum of health, right? So we have a definition of health. Health is not just the absence of disease, but it's the absence of disease in conjunction with the balance between the anabolic, so the building up processes, and the catabolic processes of a human given your life cycle. So if we take an 8-year-old kid and an 80-year-old senior citizen, which one's going to be anabolic? The 8-year-old kid.
Yeah.
The 80-year-old senior citizen is in a catabolic phase, but it still doesn't mean you can't optimize the nutrient, hormone, all the levels based upon we test and measure them, and then we intervene based upon the results of their lab testing. So it's objective. We don't go the subjective route. You test, you measure, you intervene, and you retest.
Okay. Yeah, regardless of age, sex, whatever.
100%.
So what are your main tests that you're looking at? Blood work and...
We look at, so we use 3 tests from Genova. Typically, Genova is a diagnostic lab out of the US. We use one that's called the NutraAvail, which is a blood and urine analysis. So you have the ability to look at the red blood cell content of vitamin, mineral, amino acids, fatty acids, and you can look at the organic acids in the urine to look at if there's bacterial markers in the urine, fungal markers, things that would resonate from the digestive system, but that are measurable in the urine. So that's the first test we do to kind of look inside the system as a whole. Then we look at something called the GIFX. It's a stool analysis test. And you basically collect a sample of your poop, and then you send it off to the lab, and they look at the different bacteria that's in it, if there's markers of inflammation, if there might be markers of immune deficiency, leaky gut, permeability. And the last thing we do is a food sensitivity panel to see what foods your body has determined to be inflammatory, so we can get someone off of those foods, so the basically the inflammation process can calm down, and the body can initiate the process of healing when inflammation is calm.
Perfect. So maybe that's a good segue to gut health. So you're mentioning the analysis of both the urine and feces.
Yes.
Which one is it just... which one are you mainly looking at, or is it both together?
I look at both together.
For gut health.
The thing with lab testing and being a clinician who can give a good assessment, and this is my personal opinion, is you don't just look at the variables, right? Because if you look at a gut test and you look at different bacteria, we don't know enough about the microbiome to know how much of a certain one or how little of a certain one is automatically good or bad. You look at trends. So, for example, a healthy microbiome or a healthy gut should be defined. The first thing we should say is a healthy gut is one that operates autonomously. Like, you don't know that your digestive system is operating. You don't bloat, you don't get gassy, you don't get heartburn, you don't get like a sour taste in your mouth. You don't have any signs of digestive dysfunction, first and foremost. And from there, you want to make sure that your absorption of nutrition is optimal. So you can see signs. Some people have issue subjectively with their nails, with their hair growth, with their skin. You don't see any manifestations of imbalance there. And then you go to the washroom quite frequently. You know, I have a test I do with my clients that I let them know how fast things move through their system by having them eat beets. And then I say, tell me when you shit red.
Right.
I can swear, right?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Tell me when you see red in the toilet. No, you're not bleeding internally, right? So if all those things are in a good path, you're free of symptoms of indigestion, you have good bowel transit time, you don't have any physical symptoms of imbalance, acne, oily skin, even mood swing changes, things that can relate from an inflammatory load in the gut being peripheral, that's a good starting point. And then from there, we want to ensure that you're building the foundation of what sustains a healthy gut by taking care of the digestive organ itself, and we can get into, you know, how often do you eat, the kind of foods you eat, fasting, a ketogenic diet. You're getting the necessary cofactors. So, you know, everyone's talking about what are your macros. I ask people, what are your micros? And they look at me blank, because no one ever thinks about how much magnesium do you get, how much zinc do you get every day. And then the last thing is knowing that the gut contains its own ecosystem of bacteria. And those bacteria are no different than an ecosystem in the rainforest, right? It's just a fractalized version where if you have too many predators, then the prey dies out, the predators start to die out. If you take away the predators and the prey's overrun and it starts to eat the plants, and then the ecosystem suffers. So we want to feed the gut the right substrates to allow all the different bacteria inside to basically get food to be able to sustain themselves and modulate how the body responds.
So the overall numbers from individual to individual of good bacteria and bad bacteria will be different.
Yes.
And you can measure, you know specifically these ones are the bad ones, and maybe have an overgrowth of bad ones, and you can balance it with more good bacteria?
Fundamentally, yeah. Like there are a couple bacteria that we know are terrible for you, like E. coli,
Right.
C. diff, various things like that. Like they're pathogenic in nature, and if you don't have good gut health, they can actually overrun. So when someone has an ulcer, for example, that's an H. pylori infection that's basically uncontrolled. So it gets through the mucus layer in your stomach, and it actually can create a little bit of an injury on the stomach lining, and someone feels the burn every time they eat something or when they make stomach acid. You can look at certain bacteria and know that there is an imbalance based upon them being there. But the bigger overarching concept, which is a really good thing to look at, is if you get a test done, you can look at the ratios of certain families of bacteria, and they have an associated set of physical changes with certain elevated bacterial markers. Like, for example, people who are metabolically obese, they typically have a bacteria profile that is less abundant, so there's fewer of them. And then they have higher levels of certain families, which allow the body to harness more calories from food, but make less byproducts that improve the health of the gut. So they get leaky gut, and it causes them to be more inflamed. Whereas if someone is born cesarean versus born naturally, they get a different set of bacteria coming into the world, and that will influence their physical health and behaviors down the line if they don't do something to offset that.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of interesting conversation, or topic rather, cesarean versus not.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually heard on Fridays of the week, there are more cesarean C-sections.
Really?
Because the doctors or whoever just want to get out of there and get it done.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, and apparently less than 10% of births actually are meant to be cesarean.
Yeah, if you look at the whole idea of how you came into this world, and this is a conversation that I never want to lay any blame to anyone, because let's put it this way. If the baby needs to come out, the baby needs to come out. But if we're talking in the context of gut health, how nature intended us to come into this world was that we're born naturally, so we pass through the canal that we're born in, and then the bacteria that the mom has essentially inoculates the baby, and it gives you, I call it your probiotic starter kit. And from there, if you're breastfed for a long enough period of time, the components in the breast milk help build the microbiome based upon the fact that there's fibers and carbohydrates in there that directly feed the bacteria. If you go on the other side of the spectrum, if someone is born cesarean section, they don't get inoculated by coming through the canal. They get inoculated by the skin of whoever touches their body first. And the skin microbiome profile is very different than the microbiome profile of the gut. Then on top of that, if they're fed formula, which could be dairy or it could be soy-based, they don't have the same carbohydrates and fibers that build the healthy microbiome in the same way. So what you find is there's a pretty good correlation with people who are born cesarean section developing higher levels of things like asthma, allergies, autoimmunity, gut problems at a younger age. Doesn't mean that they can't do something about it. It just means that they're starting a little bit further behind, and they have to do more to offset the fact that they unfortunately came into this world differently.
What I don't get is, I think I heard you talk on another podcast, you don't want to shit on doctors.
Never.
Right. But why is it that they're not talking about this stuff?
My personal opinion, and I will cite that always, is it's not in the best interest of how their medical paradigm is established. So, if you look at the world like a hammer, everything looks like a nail. As a doctor in the delivery room, what's the goal? Get the baby out alive. So you don't fault them for their decision, but it doesn't make them more money, nor is it in the curriculum, from my understanding, to teach them about the microbiome and how it's an ecosystem in and of itself and how it changes based upon the dynamic nature of your lifestyle.
Right.
So I think, and I spend a lot of time in the US, a lot of my colleagues in the US are doctors, I think that paradigm is starting to change, meaning that they are becoming more interested in that because the patients are going into their office knowing things that they've never thought of or heard about before, and they're saying, shit, I gotta figure out what this is all about. So the problem with our healthcare system in Canada is it's a socialized medicine, and you're paid based upon the amount of appointments you can see, and that is billable to OHIP, Ontario Health, and you want to maximize your income because as a professional, that's an important thing. I get that. Mm-hmm. I think the next wave of doctors, the ones who are becoming licensed to practice now, are going to have a different philosophy because there's so much information out there for us to learn in our free time. And I would assume most doctors, because they got into health in the first place, have an interest in it, and I think we're going to see a bit of a change. I like working with doctors. I learn things from them that I never knew.
Of course, yeah. course. It's just a different system. Like you said, if your whole business is based around people being sick, it's just different. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Keep going. Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So it's just a different way of looking at the world, right?
Yeah, always.
All right, so let's jump in. We talked a little bit about microbiome. What are your favorite topics to talk about when you talk about gut health? Like, there's so much. I know there's leaky gut, autoimmunity. Maybe let's first talk about leaky gut.
Sure. So in terms of like defining what a leaky gut is.
Yeah, let's start with the basics.
Yeah,
just
okay.
The basics.
So your digestive system is constructed in layers, right? So you have your epithelial layer, which is basically the cells that are basically jammed together. Then you have on top of that, you have a mucus layer that is divided into an area where the immune cells live. So the cells that actually kind of police what comes into the body. And then on top of that, you have where the bacteria live. And that's the ecosystem of the microbiome. So a healthy gut is one that has a good thick layer of mucus to separate the cells and the bacteria. And the cells themselves are very tightly close together. So things have to go through them, they don't get in between them. The phenomenon of leaky gut is when you start to have a breakdown in what anchors those cells together. It's actually a series of proteins that kind of they're called tight junctions, and they hold the cells together based upon the fact that they don't want things that should not enter the body to enter. Because when you digest protein, for example, protein breaks down into what? Amino acids. And amino acids are absorbed through the cells and they're delivered to where the body needs. If you have incompletely digested amino acids fall through those epithelial layers, so basically there's a gap in them, then those undigested protein molecules get into the bloodstream, and the immune system will say, well, what is this? It's not anything that we normally recognize, and they bring it to a cell that says it's either friend or it's foe. And if it says, no, this is something that we don't need in the system, and it could be like a virus, a bacteria, a pathogen, then your immune system is going to try to kill it. And when that happens over and over again from a food perspective, the immune system starts to look at foods that we eat as potential threats. So every time you eat something and it gets in between those incompletely digested and held together cells, you get an inflammatory reaction. So leaky gut is nothing more than a leak in the cells that line the digestive system. Usually it's as a result of an inflammation going on at the gut, but it also perpetuates systemic inflammation when it gets passed into the digestive system directly into the circulation of the bloodstream.
Okay. So then what causes leaky gut in the first place? Or do we even know at this point? There's so many
It's multifactorial.
Yeah.
Things that are implicated with a leaky gut development are, number one, poor digestion in general. Because usually when you don't digest your foods properly, things start to ferment and they can create byproducts of metabolism. If you don't have a good gut health in the first place from a microbiome perspective, pathogenic bacteria can actually start to break down the mucus layer, so you don't have that layer of protection over the digestive system, and it can cause these bacterial pathogens to damage the cells themselves, and they break down the tight junctions that hold them together. Hormones play a big role. Like, for example, I assume a lot of your population are avid exercise and training people, right? Yeah. So when you train really hard, you actually take blood from the gut and you disperse it away to the appendages, the arms, the legs. So if you have what's called ischemia of the gut, you have a lack of blood flow to maintain that nutrient delivery to those cells. So intensive exercise and cortisol, stress hormones, that can break your gut down as well. And then when you don't give the gut what it needs to basically supply food to the bacteria. The last aspect is if you're eating a very high protein, very low fiber but high starch diet, typical Western diet, that's really detrimental to your gut, because what happens is, imagine you have a spectrum of bacteria. I think there's about 160 or so species that they've actually discovered. There could be more likely, but there's also yeast, there's also some parasites, but they live in a good harmony. When you shrink the diversity of the gut, then you basically allow certain ones to proliferate, and if they're not the kind of bacteria that can build a good layer of mucus, then that gets compromised. If they're not the kind of bacteria that can make food for the gut, that gets compromised. So you have to really focus on what are you doing from a dietary perspective every day in order to feed the bacteria, because they eat fiber, we don't. So that's an important thing. And the last thing is sleep. We basically recover and regenerate when we sleep. And if someone is always in like a fight or flight nervous system state, they're what's called sympathetic nervous system dominant, their body is essentially always in kind of an alarm stage, and that will actually shift how well the gut can work, right? If you're stressed, how well do you digest food?
Yeah, no.
You don't. It goes right through you, right? And you leave yourself open to developing the negative consequences of what manifests when those are the signals that the body always experiences. What happens when someone trains hard is there's a period of training stress and response that's beneficial. So exercise can stimulate your body to be better at making antioxidants, especially when you also consume them from diet. But if you're always training beyond your ability to recover, then it's not just your muscles that start to compromise themselves. You get that phenomenon of I'm always tired, so your nervous system gets trashed, you're under-recovered, you're underslept, and then everything in the body is in kind of like a survival mode. So what ends up happening is these people who think they're doing something good for themselves by training hard all the time, the marker of a good workout is that they crawled out of the gym on their arms sweating. Over time, you're going to basically trash your physiology, because stress is stress, whether it's from exercise, whether it's chemically induced, emotionally, environmentally. You have to understand that there is a dose response and there is only a certain amount that everyone can do and recover from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's different for everybody.
Everyone's different. There are those freaks of nature out there who can do CrossFit 6 days a week and they're okay.
Yeah.
And there are people who have such a low threshold for stress tolerance that they do a 5K run and they take 3-4 days to recover. You know, like the idea of a marathon, there's nothing healthy about a marathon. It's a personal feat accomplishment, but to run 44 kilometers, why?
Yeah.
No offense to marathon runners, but it's more so I want to bring the awareness that exercise doesn't automatically equal healthy. Exercise stresses the body, and the body can react by basically not being able to sustain itself via the exercise process.
Wow. So what kind of exercise do you do personally? Resistance training?
I do resistance training way less intensely than I used to. Clearly I'm not a bodybuilder because I buy a medium t-shirt at Banana Republic. But I do resistance training a couple days a week. I cycle my intensities. So one day is kind of like a 20-25 minute circuit thing where I do go hard, but I'm out after 20 minutes. I try to hit the track when the weather's nice. I ran for the first time yesterday. And I'll do short sprints up to 400 meters. And then 1 or 2 days a week, I just do like what's called a contraction focus, just to keep my joints and my muscles healthy. But I really focus on actually planning my rest now. I don't plan my training like I used to. I plan my rest and I build my training around my rest programs. And because I travel so much, if there are weeks where I exercise once, then so be it. But it doesn't mean that I don't do something active every day. I try to go for a walk, try to do some kind of even just body weight. But it could be like 5-10 minutes, right?
Yeah, I'm finding that too as I'm getting older, 30s, mid-30s, you get smarter with your training.
Well, at 19, you're invincible, right? You can throw your head into a wall, your neck gets stronger. You're how old now?
34.
So I'm 31, I'll be 32 soon. I noticed that when I did high-level martial arts when I was 19, 20, 21, I could train 6 days a week, no problem. Was it good for me? No. Sports is never healthy. But now, if I were to do that, I would be just destroyed, trashed. So I plan my training smarter to know what can I deal with right now. When I'm in the country for a month, I know that I'm in a regular sleep pattern. I know that my schedule is fairly regularly contained. I can train a little bit harder. When I travel, I don't train as hard because jet lag, new area, new food, different schedules. So I plan that based upon I know that my body doesn't have the same tolerance.
Cool. So you talked about leaky gut and amino acids or peptides getting into the bloodstream, and potentially that could cause an immune reaction. So maybe that's a good segue into autoimmunity.
Sure, we can talk about autoimmunity.
So leaky gut potentially could cause autoimmunity in the body.
There's a very strong correlation. So what autoimmunity is the body attacking self. So there are proteins all over the system, right? And when one has an autoimmune reaction, your immune system is basically not well regulated. It can't distinguish you from not you. And if it's excited for whatever reason, then it can start to increase the assault on your own tissues. So autoimmunity is the body attacking its own tissues, and something is driving that. So let's say that someone has a thyroid issue. They can be very sensitive to thyroid antibodies or thyroid proteins, for example, and they can start to attack the organ. And if that person is experiencing that from a multitude of inflammatory reactions from a diet and a lifestyle perspective, then the autoimmunity is driven by those variables, but it's not to say it's automatically the cause. It's really a kind of a perfect storm of, again, genetics coming into play, lifestyle, and then the variables that you basically put into your system every day: the food, the activity, the stress, the rest, the mindfulness. But most people who suffer from autoimmune diseases, I find in clinical practice, do not have good gut health to begin with. They have issues with digesting food. They have a lot of sensitivities and reactions to food, meaning at some point they've had transient bloating, they've had constipation, they've had the opposite, where they're going to the bathroom too many times a day. And more often than not, the common foods that are implicated in that are the common foods we find most people don't tolerate well. It could be grains, could be gluten proteins, could be dairy, could be eggs, could be soy, sometimes shellfish, sometimes legumes. So it really depends on what the person's experiencing.
So would you put somebody on like an elimination type diet?
That's one way to do it. The old school, more meticulous way is doing an elimination diet and tracking. I prefer testing for food sensitivities, even if it's not perfectly foolproof. If you test someone a few times over the course of a couple years and the same foods are coming up, you likely know that the immune system is not okay with those. So what I usually do with clients is I test them if they're willing to do that, and I say, these foods, I want you to remove them from your diet for 6 months, because it takes a while for the body to calm itself down. When you eat a food that's you're allergic to, you create these what are called immune complexes. They're antibody antigen complexes, and they can stay circulating in your system for weeks, and your body will clear them out over time. But you can't keep bringing that same food in and expecting your body to clear them, because you're adding more, you're adding 5 pounds to your 4-pound pail. So I have someone go on either an elimination diet, I test them, or one of the things I found very effective is starting them on an autoimmune paleo or a ketogenic diet, because you typically take away the most common food allergies in the first place.
That's actually interesting. I just watched what was it called? The Magic Pill. It was like a movie, keto movie.
So I got my parents on a ketogenic diet, and they just literally just talked about it, saying, you should watch this movie. And I'm like, hallelujah, 5 years I've been talking to you about this, and you finally listened. What did you think of it?
I liked it.
Yeah?
Really informative, and it was interesting to contrast between that and some of the other movies like What the Health and things that we won't talk about. But talk about the movie. Did you saw the movie?
I have not seen it yet.
Okay.
No, I heard it's very good.
Yeah.
I have not seen it yet. For me, it's kind of like what those documentaries do very well is they group all the variables together that you really need to know to understand the purpose of the diet, right? So let's look at the ketogenic diet as just like what it's meant for. It used to be used for epilepsy, for kids who would not respond to drugs. But they found that there were some other metabolic benefits, because what you do is you restore metabolic flexibility to your body. When we're born, we're healthy. We haven't been on this planet very long, so we haven't had time to screw up our physiology. But as humans get old, they age. Metabolically, things don't work quite so well, especially with the typical Western diet, which was high carbohydrate, high grain, low fat, moderate protein. You become very dependent on glucose metabolism. Your body can burn carbs or it can burn fats. So when you rely on glucose metabolism, what ends up happening is your body is always tied to having carbohydrates come in. And when you don't have food coming in, what happens? You get hangry, right? Blood sugar drops, hypoglycemia. And the more you perpetuate that signal is carried forward, and the body just has to maintain that as a regular thing. What the ketogenic diet does is it forces an alternate pathway for energy metabolism. So rather than carbohydrates and glucose, you're burning primarily fats for energy. The only problem is people experience what's called like a keto flu for the first couple weeks. So you go through a glucose withdrawal. It's like getting off of a drug. It's like getting off of caffeine or anything that has an addictive quantity or property to it. You feel like shit. And the people who typically feel the worst are the ones who have the least flexible metabolisms. But once you power through, the analogy I use to people is like, imagine an assembly line, a car assembly line, and they're making Toyotas, okay? If Honda buys a Toyota power plant, then all of a sudden it needs to retool the whole assembly line, because a Toyota and a Honda are not the same car. So you have to basically retool your own cellular machinery to know how to break down fat effectively. And once you do that, you actually start to feel much better. It's like an accelerated, like a hockey stick, where it's like all of a sudden, holy shit, I'm not hungry every 2 hours. My brain feels clear. I have a good buddy who's probably watching this video right now. He drives race cars for a living. So it's kind of a focused thing, right? So we just transitioned him onto a pseudo-ketogenic diet. And he was telling me yesterday, I had dinner with him, that, Roland, I've never felt so clear. It's like when I do a qualifying lap, it's easy. And I just said, how wonderful is that, right? Because you're basically changing the default state of your body. And the conversation with him finished like this. He never knew the difference between how good you could feel when you always feel a certain way and you think that's normal. So if your normal is you feel like shit all the time, then you don't have a perspective of what feeling good is. So we need to actually show you the difference, but in order to experience that difference, you need to actually dedicate and commit the time to allowing yourself to adapt to a new way of doing that. Yeah. And then I was just down in Tampa with Dom DeAgostino, who's the world expert in ketone research, and we were discussing that there's usually, on average, about a 2 to 3 month adaptation period. You can feel better before, but to really get the benefits of long-term keto adaptation, you need to do a good 3 months. And once that's been in place, you can start to go back and forth between fuels. That's what I do. Days I'm sitting on my butt, I'm not exercising today. I'm not really going to have much glucose because I don't need it. Yesterday, before my workout, I consumed some carbohydrates. If I work out tomorrow, I will do the same thing. And that's just a little bit of a performance hack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I actually started kind of keto dieting, just not measuring things, but just on my own. Around January I started. By the end of February, I started feeling really, really good, like energy stabilized, no crashes, mental focus is way better. I feel like I'm smarter.
Well, that's what it is, right? So you do actually change how the neurons and the synapses in your brain fire. So when you have an excessive glucose load in your brain's in kind of an overfed state. So when you have too much energy in the system, your body can start making what are called free radicals. Like they're reactive oxygen species. We know them as potentially damaging molecules, or like renegades. And what they can do is they can oxidize tissues. So what that basically means is you have these compounds floating around in the cells of your brain that compromise how efficiently your brain can work. So what someone feels is, oh, I feel smarter, my memory's better, I feel clearer, my focus is better. It's just your body actually operating at the peak of efficiency it was meant to. We just forgot how to do that because of our lifestyle, diet, and all the signals that we put in ourselves on a regular basis. The physiology suffers. So it's not to say that ketogenic diet equals better IQ. It means you take away the stuff that you can't process, you better support brain energy metabolism because ketones are a cleaner burning fuel than carbs are. And long-term, the physiological changes and the genetic changes from that actually make everything work much more efficiently.
So you mentioned the keto flu.
Yes.
How long is that period? Is it different for everybody?
It's different for everyone.
Depends how bad their diet is to begin with, right?
Depends on like the state of metabolism they go into it with. So if someone's an athlete, usually it's not so bad because they have been more efficient at burning fuels because of the necessity of exercise. If someone is older, usually it's a little bit worse just because they've had more time on this planet to have more dysfunctional mitochondria. And then if there's a disease state and any kind of endocrine issues with like hormone imbalances, those usually prolong the ability for you to start feeling good. So I would say the average person can expect somewhere between 1 to 3 weeks of kind of not feeling on the top of their game. But there are ways you can get around it, right? You know, when you go on a ketogenic diet, adding salt to things is an important thing because you start to lose sodium when you lose water. Using things like MCT oils or even those ketone supplements, they help temporarily on a short-term basis because you're basically giving yourself some artificial fuel for a short-term period. And the last thing you can do is you have to really down-regulate your exercise activity and learn to just adapt to low-level activity. Walking, be it on a treadmill, walking outside. If you do an exercise routine, do not try to like set a new record. Don't go for your 1RM. Don't do high rep back squats. Like use your body weight and just go to the point where you start to feel a little bit of a challenge, but you're not overly stressing your system. Because your body's going through a panic mode when you enter a ketogenic state in some ways. So you don't want to perpetuate what really starts to drive the stress response.
So the ketogenic diet and gut health, how are they correlated?
That's a good question. So this is an interesting area of research I'm currently doing because I'm actually running a ketogenic clinic right now in Asia. Most people actually end up destroying their gut health on a ketogenic diet. And the reason is they think ketogenic is bacon, butter, and mayonnaise, right? If I don't eat carbs, it's fine. On paper, yes, that's true. However, if you take out all the fiber and the phytonutrients and the different colorful vegetables that you need on a regular basis, you start to starve out the bacteria. So if someone does a ketogenic diet improperly, somewhere down the line, they might start manifesting issues with digestive problems. And we found that from a gut health perspective, one of the biggest problems is what is called lipopolysaccharide translocation. So what that means is inside your gut, you have a lot of bacteria that have these little structures that are attached to them. They're called lipopolysaccharides. They're on the outside layer of the bacteria. And bacteria have a lifespan, so they end up living and dying. So if you have leaky gut and these LPS things get outside of your gut into your general circulation, that can induce systemic inflammation. So what happens is if someone's eating a super high-fat diet, which drives up LPS levels and they have gut problems, that can be problematic for their gut health long-term. So in order to structure a really well-defined ketogenic diet, you need to consider feeding yourself the requisite amount of fiber and a good variety of plant foods that actually have fiber and phytonutrients in them. And if well-designed, a ketogenic diet can do wonders for the gut, but if improperly designed, it can actually be very hazardous. So there's a very fine line, like a double-edged sword there when someone's doing a ketogenic diet. And if they're doing like bacon strips dipped in mayonnaise and MCT oil and butter and coffee all day long, that's not a well-constructed ketogenic diet.
Okay. So if somebody does have leaky gut, what are some of the things that they can do to help it?
First and foremost,
like probiotics and prebiotics. Maybe let's go that route.
Sure. So probiotics and prebiotics are an interesting conversation because we still don't know exactly what the core group of bacteria that every human has should be. But I use symptom response based upon what I give to people. There are certain companies out there that make really good probiotics. There's certain companies out there that make some that aren't so great. So doing your research to look at what companies specifically specialize in gut health is probably a first step. If you're using probiotics and you're getting a beneficial response, that means that those bacteria are temporarily inducing a change in you. So it's almost like you're taking species and you're planting them in a new ecosystem, and they're actually taking to the ecosystem. You want to make sure that on top of increasing the probiotic intake, you want to give those bacteria food. So that's varying your kinds of fibers, carbohydrates, and phytonutrients that come in. So the foods I typically tell people to focus on are fibrous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, providing they don't give you gas, leafy vegetables, and then different color vegetables, right? So if someone doesn't want to do a low-carb diet, purple sweet potatoes, beets, red peppers, things like zucchini, which is high fiber, high water, low carb content, actually works well. Different kinds of fruits, right? Apples, berries, because they contain different kind of fibers that feed different kinds of microbiome families. So you want to make sure that you're varying your fibers to support the probiotics that you're taking. And then another thing is how frequently someone eats. So if you're constantly eating every 2 to 3 hours, that actually puts a stress on your gut. And you can have, it's called postprandial, so post-feeding induced lipopolysaccharide increases. So if someone's trying to actually improve the health of their gut, not eating too frequently is a really good thing to do because it allows the bacteria to diversify more when you actually fast. It's another reason why ketogenic diet works well, because it's mimicking the benefits of fasting, which is good for your gut health. You take the energy that you would use to break down food, and it's actually directed at restructuring, cleaning out, if you will, old worn out cells and bacteria in your gut, so your gut actually becomes healthier. And to finish that, there are some other supplements you can use to help rebuild, like the mucus layers and the actual cells in the microbiome itself. Things like colostrum, specialized fibers, certain herbs have a very anti-inflammatory effect. But again, I always like to say, get a sense of what you're working with before you just start throwing things at your gut, because if you're not assessing, you're kind of guessing.
I like that. So maybe here's a good segue to, I wanted to ask you what your typical diet looks like, because, you know.
I ate a burger and fries on the way over here. It was really
Did you
good.
really?
No.
Okay.
I wouldn't have made it. I would have been in the bathroom.
Right, so let's talk about morning. What are you having? How long if you're fasting, if you're not fasting, and what kind of supplements, if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, of course. Okay. My diet changes based upon where I am. So when I'm in Canada, I eat a certain way in the winter and I eat a certain way in the summer. It's kind of seasonal. So one thing I always say to my clients, if they love bananas and mangoes and all that, and they're eating them in the dead of winter and they have issues with gut health, those sugars can be problematic. For example, I say, where's the banana tree in Canada? Doesn't exist. So in the winter, I eat less carbohydrates because for me, it makes more sense to connect with what our environment would best be suited to. So I usually wake up and I don't eat anything other than I have some black coffee blended up with a little bit of MCT oil because I do want to extend my carbohydrate fast after I wake up. My first meal of the day, which is usually around 11, 12 o'clock. Today I had a grass-fed beef burger and I made a salad with radicchio, broccoli sprouts, avocado, and some fermented beets. And I also had some blackberries and some vegetables on the side. So that was my first meal. And I won't eat again until tonight, probably around 7 o'clock. And I will have a little bit of a higher protein content because I want protein to sustain me in the overnight fast. Days I exercise, I have some carbohydrates before my workout, and I have some amino acids afterwards. And supplements I take, I usually rotate good multivitamins. Right now I use, what do I use right now? I use a Designs for Health product. I use a couple supplements from ATP Labs. I do some work with them. They're a great company, so I use their magnesium in the evening. I use their alpha GPC complex in the morning to help my fast and to help my brain performance. From a probiotic perspective, I like using some stuff from Megaspore. They have a very interesting technology of spore-based probiotics that I find have been very helpful for people with really bad gut issues. And I don't use a ton of supplements. I rotate things occasionally, but for the most part, I try to cover my bases with good amino acids, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, bacteria, and occasionally I rotate things like fish oil in. Sometimes I use some specialized nutrients. Sometimes I use things like melatonin to help me with sleep and jet lag recovery. But other than that, I try to do what I can mostly from food. One of the biggest pieces of advice I'd give to people when it comes from food is see how many different varieties of food you eat in a day. You know, the average person probably eats about 14 to 16 different foods per year, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. North America, vegetables are carrots, celery, cucumbers, maybe some iceberg lettuce. I try to eat at least 5 to 7 different foods per meal. So my body's getting a big variety of not only nutrients, but also different kinds of fiber and phytonutrient content. Because if you're looking at deficiencies, if you only eat the same 7 foods, let's use the bodybuilding diet, oatmeal, skinless chicken breast, sweet potato, broccoli, maybe a tablespoon of peanut butter, spinach, maybe some flank steak. On days you can have a little bit more fat. You're only getting the nutrients that are in those foods. So long term, if that's all you do, you're running a nutrient deficiency of whatever you don't get through your diet. And there's always going to be holes in every diet. There's no perfect diet out there. So I look at what's in my food. I always do a little bit of like a matrix analysis. If I'm at a restaurant, for example, I'm looking at the different foods, like what are in these things? What do I get from eating this? And then I layer on top what kind of diet am I doing. So if it's a low carb diet, I'm going to try to vary as many foods as I can, high fiber, moderate to high fat, moderate protein, low carb. And that's kind of what I do right now. And I find I feel best. I have to remember to eat some days because I just don't get hungry. That's the problem. You start to waste away.
Yeah. Same with me. If I check the scale and if I'm tipping in under 195 or even like 190, then I know I need to bump up my calories.
And you still can build muscle on a low carb, high fat diet. You just need to increase your caloric content. Because I mean, if you bring in 3,000 to 4,000 calories, even if there's no carbs in there, that's still an anabolic diet. You're still getting a ton of energy.
Yeah, exactly. I find coupled with the intermittent fasting, it's just, you got to remember to get those calories in.
You do. You have to eat more at the time frame you give yourself. You know, one thing I always tell people is create an eating window for yourself, or a feeding and a fasting time. And I always start with 12 hours on, 12 hours off for the average person. If you're athletic, if you're highly active, you don't want to fast for too long and expend too much energy. However, if you're trying to do it from an anti-aging perspective, or you want to lose some body fat or reduce the stress of digestion, I say shrink your eating window to about 8 hours, and then extend your fasting window so you can get a longer fast every day, because you can get some of the benefits of fasting without running nutritional deficiencies or starving yourself to keep up with day-to-day life.
Cool, I like that. Man, we hit on a lot of things. How are you doing on time?
I got all the time in the world.
Okay,
buddy.
cool. We talked about fasting and intermittent fasting. Oh, here's something I want to talk to you about is The kids' diet.
Kids' diet.
Kids' diet of chicken finger and fries.
Oh God.
And how do you feel? Maybe how do you feel about that? Or obviously we know the answer, but maybe talk about it a little bit.
Okay, so I'm going to cite this. I don't have kids, so everything I'm talking about is from an ideal or a theoretical perspective. The challenge I see with kids is we've created kind of an environment for kids to eat based upon their tastes for things. And food companies know this well. If you go to a grocery store, what groceries are at the children's aisle? Like the colorful Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms, or kids can see. They put like the high fiber, even cereal I don't recommend, but high fiber cereals are at the top. Kids aren't going to look up at Honey Bunches of Oats or whatever the hell people eat. So they fall prey to marketing based upon what's visually appealing, and what do humans love to eat? Sugar and fat. Those two together, you get a donut, you get pizza, you get the delicious food groups, right? So the thing that we have to keep in mind for kids is kids are already being marketed to influence their food choices before they're old enough to make their own, or to have the awareness of saying, oh, this is good for me, this is bad for me. If I put a bowl of broccoli and a bowl of Doritos on a table, what's a kid going to eat? We know every 10 times out of 10, the thing that tastes better. So when it comes to basically feeding your children, I think an important thing is finding a way to get kids involved in the process so they have some kind of emotional investment in the food, rather than just saying, well, I'll put a plate of broccoli in front of you, and if you eat it or you don't, I tried. The biggest thing with kids is if you develop their taste for junk food at a young age, it actually wires the taste buds to not be able to palate foods that aren't hyper sweet or hyper salted or hyper fatty, right? So you have to start from a young age to introduce them to a wide variety of foods, so you develop their palate and they can actually eat a Brussels sprout or eat a piece of broccoli or eat, a fruit and find it sweet, rather than wanting gummy bears and this other stuff. When it comes to feeding kids, people have this like, oh, it's for kids, it shouldn't be what adults have. Kids actually in many ways need more nutrients to support growth and development than adults do, who are past the age of physical maturity. Do they need more energy? Probably not overall, but kids need a very well-balanced, and I hate using that word. When I say well-balanced, I mean they need a large variety of food, and they need to make sure that you're getting adequate micronutrients to turn all the carbs, proteins, and fats they eat into the energy or the building blocks of muscles and basically the cells that support growth and development. So if you're undernourishing your child, the uphill battle is you need to find a way to get those nutrients into them. And supplementation for kids has its place, but fundamentally it's developing the eating habits for their kids first and foremost. I used to work with a lot of athletes that were 9 to 13, 14 years old, and I'd see what they'd bring to these training practices that I run, and I'd watch the kids, they'd eat their cookies or granola bars or whatever, and an hour into the workout they'd start to get fatigued, they'd start to perform less optimally, they'd start to behave differently, they'd start to talk back. And a lot of the things we're doing to our kids nowadays from a diet perspective is accelerating what we're seeing in mature populations, because I see kids with leaky gut, I see kids with autoimmunity, I see people who at a very young age have asthma diagnosis and they're on different medications. I see people the age of 12 who are metabolically obese. I see kids who have, like males, who have feminine physiological qualities to them because their estrogen levels are too high from their diet and their lifestyle. So that's an important thing when it comes to kids.
When do you think we're going to turn the corner? When's the tipping point and we're going to be like, enough is enough and let's just tackle this thing?
I think it's going to be a steady progress, or a progression rather. The important thing about what's going on with health nowadays is there's a ton of amazing people who are pushing forwards big platforms to give people the power to take health into your own hands. You have to have some kind of emotional investment in your health. A really funny story, and it's kind of like, it perfectly fits with what you asked. So I was in the US recently, and we had our first health optimization event where we had a conference. And the day after, all of us, there's a big group of us, we were just kind of relaxing outside a little bit, and we're having an issue with one of the toilets in the Airbnb house we rented. So someone actually clogged the toilet, and they thought it'd be a good idea to pour Drano on the clog, knowing that you need to deal with a clog a different way. So when we found that out, I was with a buddy there, his name's Ari Witten. He runs a really good podcast called The Energy Blueprint. And he said, isn't that a perfect metaphor for healthcare? Just pouring Drano on a turd, thinking that it's gonna break itself up, right? I think that old paradigm is starting to die off. Whereas if someone goes into a doctor's office and they're more informed about gut health, about mitochondrial function, about nutrient deficiencies, they're going to realize a couple things. One, that drug therapies, for example, work better in healthy people. And then maybe eventually that healthy person will be able to get off of their drug therapy because their body's working better. Number two, I think that's going to drive physicians to have a much better scope and breadth of knowledge based upon the fact that they need to know what their clients are asking them, or else it makes them lose a little bit of credibility as a health professional. And I think hopefully in our lifetime we're going to see that medicine, Western allopathic medicine and alternative, whatever, they're going to kind of meet in the middle. And we're going to find that there are places for drugs, there are places where drugs don't work, there are places for nutrients, there are places where they don't work. And if we can, rather than be at odds with each other, we can converge and actually create a more harmonious, complementary relationship among healthcare professionals. I think we're in the process of starting to see that. I personally believe. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I'm hopeful, man. I'm hopeful for the future. I think people like you that are out there in the field and educating people about this stuff, and I'm starting to slowly see a shift. We're not at the point where health is it's still getting worse at this point, but I mean, people are out there. The internet has been such a great thing. Well, detrimental in some ways because there's bad information out there. But
there's bad information on the internet?
Right?
Really?
Yes.
Don't tell me.
Right? But then people have access to people like you throughout the whole world. Like people watching this right now could be anywhere in the world.
That's what's wonderful.
Yeah. So
my hope is the whole the contagious aspect of what it is that this momentum that health generates is going to start to infect people. And I use infect in a positive term, right? It's the idea of, not being sick isn't enough. It's the idea of maybe saying, well, look, I've seen my parent, my aunt, my uncle, a family member go through something I never want to experience. So that's going to have someone thinking prevention. Or it could be, I used to feel like shit and I did all these health things and I learned from this website and this podcast. It's people like you who are pushing this forwards because it's going to give people the inspiration to start to maybe investigate and learn into their health a little bit, right? Most people don't know how their body works. They have no idea that your stomach does a certain thing and your small intestine does something and your colon does something, and each cell is built to work as a unit, and each thing inside the cell is meant to do a certain job. If you start to learn a little bit about how those things work, you start to understand that everything we do is an input. It's a signal, right? So diet is a signal, a supplement is a signal, exercise, sleep. It's the collective signals that essentially generate what the outcome looks like. So a healthy person has to, on a regular basis, constantly put in the same signals and variables if they want the health outcome to be their existence. If you do it sometimes and you don't do it other times, I can probably predict what your health status is going to look like. And if you never prioritize healthy signals, and then you start asking, well, why did I get sick? Why me? Why am I suffering? I say to my clients, how old are you right now? They give me their age, and I say, well, how long have you been suffering with this? And if it's like 15 years, it's not going to fix itself in 6 weeks. It's going to take enough time for us to put in the right signals that shift that physiology to start focusing on healthful, not disease-based practices.
Man, I'm sure you see it a lot, and it sounds like you're the same as me, is you'll see a client that's, not in optimal health, and you almost want it more for them than they want it for themselves. How crazy is that?
It's a problem of being a healthcare provider in the sense where you have your emotional investment in the client. As a professional who's providing a service, I think it's a really important thing to know how to walk that line, because you can never do something for someone else if it's not your existence. You can be there for support, you can be there to guide, to educate, to assist, but then you start fighting your own uphill battle because your emotional health starts to suffer if your client doesn't give a shit. And if their investment financially to you isn't enough, maybe it's just not their time to do that yet. As that's I learned that at a young age when I was so invested in working with people. It's not to say that I'm not, but I want to qualify the person to make sure they're really ready to take this on, because it becomes a bit of a full-time job, especially if their health isn't good to start with.
I like that, man. Good. Awesome. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on before?
The thing that's going to be interesting in the next little bit, if I could just announce, is I'll be opening up the world's first health optimization clinic in Canada, hopefully in the next few months. This month, we're going to hopefully secure a location. So the health optimization framework that's created by my mentor, Dr. Ted Achacoso, is going to have a hub. And therefore, we can start pushing out both the patient care program, but also the clinician training program, because we want to change the course of medicine a little bit with what it is we're going to be teaching people in terms of how to invest in your health, not so focus on a disease. And the whole goal is to work with all different walks of practitioner, not to replace them, but to say, look, if you are a medical doctor focusing on managing someone with autoimmune arthritis, let's work together because your anti-inflammatory drugs are going to work better if the patient has an optimal vitamin A status, vitamin D, this, that, and the next. So I'm really excited to start to push this out and change the course of, I would hope to say how we see healthcare, however grand that sounds. That's what I would like to see. I'm going to do a shameless plug. I have a business partner whose name's Alexandra Baird, and she runs an amazing company called Ripe Nutrition, and we're actually going to take a whole philosophy of health and science approach to food. So we do different kinds of broth, vegan, chicken broth. We're going to be launching some new stuff soon, and it's going to be in the same vein of we want to take health into control of the consumer's hands by educating them on what it is you need to feed your body on a regular basis. So those projects are a lot of fun. They're coming down the pipeline, and maybe at some point we could do a follow-up and dive into some of the details of what it's like to do client care with health optimization.
Man, I'd love that.
Cool.
Thanks, Roland.
No worries. Thank you.
All right.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Biceps and Banter with Brandon Crow. If you like our show, do us a huge subscribe, toss a review on iTunes, or maybe share the show with your friends. And if you want to know more, find us at fastingftw.com. Our Patreon is patreon.com/fastingftw.